What do you do when your mathematics are perfect? Your calculations flawless, but your shells are killing your own men. Lieutenant Anderson faced this nightmare at Krithia, where the precise science of artillery became the imprecise horror of friendly fire. Edinburgh, March 1915. Lieutenant Robert Anderson packed his slide rule alongside his service revolver, his calculation notebooks next to his ammunition. At 24, he was one of the youngest officers in the Royal Field Artillery. But his Cambridge mathematics degree made him invaluable for the complex ballistic calculations needed for modern warfare. "Mathematics will win this war, Father," he had written to Professor James Anderson, his father and fellow Cambridge mathematician. "Precise calculations, accurate range finding, scientific methodology. The Germans may have superior guns, but we have superior minds applying superior mathematics to the problem." Robert believed war was simply physics made lethal. Trajectories, wind resistance, gravitational drop, all solvable through mathematical formulas. His battery, the 156th Heavy Artillery, had trained extensively in ballistic science. Every shell's path could be predicted, every impact calculated with mathematical precision. What Robert didn't understand was that mathematics meant nothing when human error entered the equation. April 25th, 1915. The Gallipoli landings began with the heaviest artillery barrage Robert had ever calculated. From their positions behind Cape Helles, the 156th Battery provided covering fire for British infantry advancing on Turkish trenches. Robert's calculations were flawless, elevation angles precise to the degree, wind compensation calculated to the meter. But as the morning progressed, something went wrong. Reports came back from the forward observers that shells were falling short, landing among British troops instead of Turkish positions. The mathematics were perfect, but men were dying from their own artillery. Captain Morrison, the battery commander, studied Robert's calculations frantically. "Your numbers are correct, Anderson. Range, 3,200 meters. Elevation, 12 degrees, 30 minutes. Wind compensation, minimal. The shells should be landing exactly on the Turkish trenches." Robert checked and rechecked his mathematics. Every calculation was flawless, every variable accounted for. Yet British soldiers were being killed by British shells, and no one could explain why. The perfect mathematics were about to reveal an imperfect truth that would haunt Robert forever. The answer came during the second barrage. Sergeant Williams, manning the rangefinder, discovered the horrifying truth. Their maps were wrong. The Turkish trenches shown on their artillery maps were positioned 200 meters further north than the real trenches. Every mathematically perfect calculation had been based on incorrect coordinates. "Sir," Williams reported, his voice shaking, "the maps are off. The Turkish positions aren't where we think they are. We've been shelling our own lads for 3 hours." Robert felt his mathematical certainty crumble. All his precise calculations, his scientific methodology, his Cambridge training, none of it mattered when the fundamental data was wrong. Mathematics required truth, but war was built on incomplete information and deadly assumptions. The 156th Battery had fired 247 shells that morning. Robert's calculations indicated that at least 60 had fallen among British positions. His mathematics could tell him exactly how many of his countrymen he had helped kill, down to the probable casualty figures based on shell dispersion patterns. But the mathematics of war were about to become even more personal. The corrected barrage began immediately. Robert recalculated every angle, every trajectory based on the true Turkish positions. His mathematics were still perfect, his calculations still flawless. This time, the shells would land exactly where intended. Through his field glasses, Robert watched his perfectly calculated shells impact the Turkish trenches. The explosions were mathematically precise, the destruction scientifically predictable. Turkish soldiers died according to ballistic formulas that Robert had personally verified. But as the smoke cleared, Robert saw something that no mathematical formula could have prepared him for. Among the Turkish defenders was a young artillery officer, roughly his own age, frantically trying to calculate counter-battery fire with his own slide rule and notebooks. The Turkish officer looked exactly like Robert, young, educated, believing that mathematics could impose order on the chaos of war. In that moment, Robert realized he wasn't fighting an abstract enemy. He was killing men who thought exactly like him, who relied on the same mathematical principles, who believed in the same scientific certainties. What happened next would force Robert to calculate the one equation no Cambridge degree had prepared him for. That afternoon, British infantry advanced across no man's land toward the Turkish trenches. Robert's artillery provided covering fire, each shell placed with mathematical precision to clear obstacles and suppress enemy positions. His calculations were perfect. His mathematics gave the British soldiers the best possible chance of survival. But war, Robert was learning, didn't respect mathematical probability. Despite perfect artillery support, the attack failed. British soldiers died not from mathematical errors, but from the fundamental chaos that no calculation could control. Courage failing at crucial moments, unexpected machine gun positions, the simple random brutality of combat. Private Davies, the battery's youngest gunner, had a brother in the attacking infantry. He asked Robert to calculate the probability of his brother's survival given optimal artillery support and standard casualty rates for infantry assaults. Robert could perform the calculation. He knew the mathematical formulas for combat effectiveness, casualty probabilities, survival rates. But for the first time in his life, he refused to apply mathematics to a human problem. The numbers that haunted Robert weren't the ones he calculated, but the ones he couldn't. May 6, 1915. The Second Battle of Krithia began with another massive artillery barrage. Robert's battery had new maps, verified coordinates, double-checked calculations. This time, there would be no friendly fire incidents. The mathematics would be perfect. But as Robert prepared his calculations, a disturbing thought occurred to him. He had become too good at the mathematics of killing. He could calculate exactly how many Turkish soldiers would die from each barrage, predict casualty rates with scientific precision, determine the optimal shell distribution for maximum human destruction. His Cambridge education had taught him to find elegant solutions to complex problems. War had taught him that the most complex problem, how to kill other human beings efficiently, had the most elegant mathematical solutions. The barrage began at dawn. Robert's calculations were flawless, his mathematics perfect. Turkish positions were systematically destroyed according to scientific principles. The artillery did exactly what the mathematics predicted it would do. But perfect mathematics were about to create an imperfect moral crisis. As the infantry advanced, Robert received reports through the field telephone. The attack was succeeding. Turkish resistance was crumbling under the mathematically optimized artillery barrage. His calculations were saving British lives and achieving military objectives. But among the reports came news that made Robert's mathematical certainty meaningless. The Turkish artillery officer he had observed, the young man with the slide rule, had been killed in the barrage. The shell that killed him had been fired from Robert's gun, calculated by Robert's mathematics, aimed by Robert's precise equations. Robert had killed his mathematical counterpart, a young man who believed in the same scientific principles, who probably had the same Cambridge education, who thought mathematics could bring order to war's chaos. The mathematics had worked perfectly. The human cost was incalculable. That night, Robert sat in his dugout, surrounded by his calculation books and mathematical instruments. For the first time since arriving at Gallipoli, he couldn't bring himself to perform ballistic calculations. Mathematics had given him the power to kill with scientific precision, but it couldn't tell him whether he should. What Robert wrote in his final letter would reveal the equation that mattered most. In his last letter to his father, written 3 days before a Turkish shell ended his mathematical career forever, Robert described his crisis of mathematical faith. Father, Cambridge taught us that mathematics reveals universal truths, that numbers don't lie, that precise calculations lead to reliable conclusions. But I've learned that mathematics applied to human destruction creates truths too terrible to accept. Robert had calculated that his battery's shells had killed approximately 340 Turkish soldiers and wounded an estimated 600 more. The mathematics were precise, the numbers reliable. But mathematics couldn't calculate the value of those lives, couldn't quantify the grief of Turkish families, couldn't compute the moral weight of scientific killing. I've become too efficient at the mathematics of death, Robert wrote. My calculations are flawless, my equations elegant, my solutions precise. But mathematics that solves for human destruction isn't mathematics. It's something darker, something that Cambridge never taught us to question. Robert had discovered that perfect mathematics applied to imperfect moral problems created perfect moral disasters. But Robert's final calculation would solve an equation that no university could teach. On May 9, 1915, a Turkish shell landed directly on the 156th Battery's command post. The impact was mathematically precise, a perfect ballistic solution calculated by a Turkish artillery officer using the same mathematical principles Robert had mastered at Cambridge. Robert died instantly, killed by mathematics as precise as his own. His calculation notebooks were found scattered around the destroyed gun position, pages filled with elegant equations that had determined the fate of hundreds of men. But in his final letter, discovered in his personal effects, Robert had written his most important calculation. The value of human life cannot be expressed as a mathematical function. I've spent months calculating how to kill efficiently, but I've never calculated whether killing is justified. Mathematics can tell us how to destroy, only conscience can tell us whether we should. Private Davies survived the war and returned to Edinburgh, carrying Robert's final letter to Professor Anderson. The older mathematician read his son's words and understood that Robert had solved the most complex equation of all: the relationship between scientific capability and moral responsibility. Professor Anderson kept Robert's calculation notebooks but never opened them again. He had taught his son that mathematics revealed universal truths, but Robert had discovered that some truths were too universal to bear. That perfect mathematics applied to human destruction created perfectly unacceptable results. The 156th Battery was reformed with new officers, new calculations, new mathematical precision. The war continued with scientific efficiency, mathematical accuracy, and ballistic perfection. But Robert Anderson had calculated the cost of mathematical warfare and found the equation morally unsolvable. In a small Edinburgh study, Professor Anderson kept his son's slide rule as a reminder that mathematics, however perfect, must serve humanity, not the other way around. Robert's final calculation had solved for the value that mattered most: the immeasurable worth of human conscience in a world obsessed with mathematical precision. Lieutenant Robert Anderson never solved the mathematics of war, but he had calculated something more important: the formula for remaining human when science makes killing too easy.